Alright, hello everybody. My name is Dustin, and I am making a three-part video series that will serve as an introduction to 6 Max No Limit Hold'em. This is going to be my first video for iPoker VIP. I'm pretty excited about making videos here now and in the future. So basically what this series is going to cover, there's going to be 3 videos. The first one, which is this one, is going to be a general introduction. I'm going to go over some important concepts that might often be overlooked, and I'm going to get into pre-flop basics at the end of the video. The second video is going to focus on flop play, and the third video will focus on the turn and river, and go over some tilt control stuff, and just do some general hand examples kind of to put it all together. So first, I'll just talk a little bit about who I am. My name is Dustin, like I mentioned before. I'm 24 years old. Online poker has been my main source of income for the past 6 or so years. For a while, I was kind of just grinding 50 NL and doing okay, like making a good deal more than my friends were making at day jobs or whatever, but I wasn't really focused on improving or getting better or moving up. And then about a year or so ago, around the time Full Tilt came out with Rush Poker, I started playing Rush, and I started really focusing more on poker, making an effort to improve, watching a bunch of training videos, talking a lot more poker with some poker friends. And since then I just have improved a lot, moved up, started coaching, etc. And I just wanted to mention that online poker can be a really great opportunity to basically afford you whatever kind of life you want to live. Personally, I'm pretty into music and also into doing primitive skill stuff in the woods, and online poker has made it possible for me to pursue both of those interests. So that's been really nice. And then obviously April 15th of this year was Black Friday. I could no longer play. I grew up in Georgia. I've been living in Tennessee in the United States. So pretty recently I moved down here to Costa Rica for a while so I could start making some money again. And that's where I've been for the past month or so. Oh, here's just a graph of all of my 2-4 rush hands. Like I said, I moved up through the rush limits from 50 NL to 400 NL. And I guess just to show you guys that I have some credibility, here's a graph of all my 400 NL rush. As you can see, I was making a little bit more than 4 big blinds per 100, which I think is pretty decent. Alright. Now I'm going to get into the necessary tools that you're going to need to be a successful online poker player. Obviously you're going to need a decent computer. I say preferably PC because I believe Hold'em Manager, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, only runs on the PC, and they're just there's more poker software that's made for the PC and not for the Mac. And obviously you'll need your poker client, etc. Definitely you're going to need either Poker Tracker 3 or Hold'em Manager, and I guess Hold'em Manager 2 just came out, so that's an option too. I know Poker Tracker, they're working on Poker Tracker 4, which should be out in a few months. But anyway, one of these programs is super important. It's going to track your play to let you know how you're doing and how you can improve, but additionally, it'll track all your opponent's play, and you can use a HUD, which stands for Heads Up Display, and it just displays whatever stats you want of your opponents on the poker table. By the way, before I get into that, on iPokerVIP.com you can find a discount for either Poker Tracker 3 or Hold'em Manager. So make sure to do that if you don't have one of those programs already. I prefer Poker Tracker 3 just because the HUD is a little bit more powerful, but I know most people prefer Hold'em Manager, so both programs offer a free trial if you want to try them out for yourself. In terms of getting a HUD set up, I would really strongly recommend trying something like this HUD. I think all of these stats are going to be super important. I'll just go over them pretty quickly. The first, we have VPIP, which stands for voluntarily put money in pot, and it's just an indicator of how loose people are pre-flop. And then we have pre-flop raise, what percent someone raises pre-flop. And then the number of hands that you have on a certain player is going to be really important, just so you know how reliable your sample size is. Like, if you have 5 hands on someone and their VPIP is 50, it's probably not actually 50, but you've just happened to see them play. I guess it can't be 50 if you only have 5 hands, but you know what I mean. You need like a good amount of hands on someone to start relying on these stats. In terms of VPAP and PFR, probably you can start to get a decent idea after just like 50 hands, but obviously the more the better. And then when you get into some of these post-flop stats, you're going to need like hundreds of hands, and preferably thousands. But okay, the next line on my hypothetical HUD, we have pre-flop 3-bet. And we're going to talk about what this stuff means later on. And then fold to pre-flop 3-bet. Attempt to steal, which is how often someone open raises from either the cutoff button or small blind. And then fold big blind to steal. And that's going to be able to tell you how often you should be attempting to steal. And then in terms of post-flop stats, we have c-bet flop, c-bet turn, fold to flop c-bet, fold to turn c-bet. And the reason I have these stats in this order, like a lot of players will have c-bet flop, fold to flop c-bet, and then c-bet turn, fold to turn c-bet. But I really think this order is a lot better, because when you're the pre-flop raiser, the 2 stats you're going to want to be looking at on your opponent's HUD are generally going to be fold to flop c-bet and fold to turn c-bet. And it's just good to have those right next to each other. And then alternatively, when you just cold call pre-flop, the two stats you're going to want to be looking at are how often your opponent c-bets the flop and c-bets the turn. And it's just a lot easier if you can look at those 2 stats right next to each other. So that's that. And then it's definitely important to have a comfortable workspace, preferably like a reasonably nice chair and desk. You don't want to throw your back out playing poker, basically. And then there are other programs too, like PokerStove is a useful tool for calculating equity, and it's free. And then Table Ninja and Key Poker are kind of similar programs. Table Ninja only works on PokerStars, I think, and Key Poker is for a bunch of sites. And basically, you can, through these programs, you can assign hotkeys to do certain actions, so that you don't have to use a mouse, or you can just use a mouse less. Like you can make some of your keys like 1 key fold, 1 key call, 1 key raise, so you don't have to keep clicking with your mouse. And if you're going to be playing a lot of online poker, that becomes pretty important. I myself have had like hand and wrist problems from playing with a mouse too often, so now I actually play with a Nintendo 64 controller and one of these hotkey programs. Alright, bankroll management. This is one of the most important concepts that new players often overlook. Obviously, a bankroll is how much money you have set aside for poker. And if you don't have a large enough bankroll for the stakes that you're playing, you're pretty much guaranteed to go broke at some point. Now, how much you have in your bankroll kind of depends on your goals with poker. If you're a professional player, you want to have a larger bankroll because you depend on that money to make more money, so you need to ensure that you don't lose it. If poker is just a hobby for you, if you're just getting into it, you can afford to have a bankroll on the smaller side because maybe you're okay with depositing more money from your bank account. Maybe you're willing to move down in stakes. So the specific number of buy-ins kind of depends on all these things, but sort of a general conservative guideline is to have 50 buy-ins for whatever stake you're playing. So for 100 NL, for example, that would be $5,000. At smaller stakes, like 50 NL and below, especially like 10 NL, 25 buy-ins is probably going to be sufficient, especially if you're willing to move down if you run bad. And at higher stakes, like if you get up to 400 NL and higher, then you're probably going to want more like 100 buy-ins, because obviously players are a lot better, so you're going to have higher variance. And there's this saying that I think came from someone on 2+2 in the poker community, that at some point you will run worse than you ever thought possible. And I've definitely experienced that twice, and it's just something you should have in mind. Like, you will run bad, it'll seem ridiculous, but it's part of being a poker player, is handling it. Alright, so here I made a little image of the different positions in 6 max. We have the button, and these are the letters that I'm going to use to abbreviate the different positions. So this is the button, obviously. One away from the button is the cutoff. Then up here we have middle position, sometimes referred to as the hijack. Generally, this position is referred to as the hijack when talking about full ring, and middle position when talking about 6 max. So I'm probably just going to refer to it as middle position from here on out. And then we have under the gun, which is first to act pre-flop. And then we have the big blind and the small blind. And the reason I chose to count backwards from the button is because, let's say the cutoff, let's say you're in a 6 max game, there's 6 people sitting down, but the cutoff is sitting out. That would mean that the player in this position would actually be the cutoff, and the player in this position would actually be middle position, even though it's still under the gun. Alright. Okay, so a player's opening range is the hands with which a player raises when no one else has yet voluntarily entered the pot. So basically, if you're in middle position and under the gun folds, then your opening range is going to be whatever hands you choose to raise with. So when you're under the gun, your opening range should be the tightest. This is because A, there are the most players left to act behind you who might pick up a strong hand, and B, when you do get called, you're likely to play out of position, which is going to put you in tough and often negative EV spots post-flop. As you get closer to the button, your opening range should gradually widen, being loosest on the button. This is because on the button, there are only 2 players left to act, and you are guaranteed to play in position post-flop. So basically, kind of to recap, the earlier your position, the tighter your opening range should be, and the later your position, the looser your opening range should be. And as you start moving up in stakes, people are going to be more and more aware of this. So for example, if you, maybe when you move up to 100 NL or something, regs in the blinds are going to know that you're going to be opening pretty wide on the button. So basically, you can adjust to that in a couple of ways. You can tighten up on the button, or you can just start flatting their 3-bets more often, or you can start 4-bet bluffing their 3-bets. Clearly, it all depends on your opponents and your hand, etc. But just something to have in mind. Alright, so you might find hand charts online, and I have like some general guidelines down here, but your opening ranges, especially at 6 max, should be really dependent on who the other players at the table are, and also somewhat on your confidence in your post-flop play. If you have really tight nits behind you, for example, generally you should be opening more hands, and if you have really aggressive players behind you, generally you should be opening fewer hands. I think for pretty obvious reasons. So here's some kind of general guidelines. If you don't understand this notation, I'll try to just explain it briefly. A10 S means basically ace 10 suited or better. So ace-10 suited, ace-jack suited, ace-queen suited, ace-king suited, etc. And then the O stands for offsuit. And when we have two cards right next to each other and then a plus, that just means that those cards are connectors. So basically, like king-queen plus means king-queen and ace-king. And then obviously fives plus means pocket fives and all pocket pairs better than fives. So I don't necessarily recommend that you write this down, but kind of just, if you're not comfortable with preflop opening range, kind of just, take a look at this and get a general feel for what you should be opening in each position. And by the way, when you do start to feel more comfortable in your post-flop play, you can definitely start opening more under the gun. You can start opening any pair, sometimes like any suited ace, stuff like that. Alright, so how big should I raise? In general, it's pretty safe to make your standard raise sizes 3x from under the gun, middle position, cut off the small blind. It might actually be a better idea to make it 3.5x from under the gun, just because you're going to have a stronger range, so it's good to put more money in the pot when you have a good hand. And then also, you're probably going to be playing out of position, and having the stacks a little bit shallower makes playing out of position a little bit easier because it gives your opponent less of a stack to make moves on you when he's in position. Yeah. And then a good standard, I think, is to make it 2.5x. And what x means basically is multiples of big blinds. So 3x means 3 big blinds. So if you're playing 25 cent, 50 cent, then 3x would be $1.50. Alright. Generally, you should be making it 2.5x from the button, kind of for the opposite reasons that I just mentioned, which is that on the button you're going to be opening a wide range, so you don't want to put in dead money for the times that you get 3-bet and you're going to have to fold. And then also, you're going to be playing in position, so having a deeper stack in position is good. So these raise sizes are pretty flexible. A couple of examples where they would change is if there's a big fish at the table who's pretty much calling anything, then you can pretty much make it as big as you think he'll call with your really strong hand. So if you have aces and there's a fish that's calling everything, maybe just make it 8x. If you're on the button, it's often a good idea to just min-raise it and make it 2x. Two different situations where this is good is one, if there are super tight nits in the blinds. This is because they're probably just going to fold no matter how big you make it, so it's better to just basically bluff for cheaper. And when you get 3-bet by a nit, you're going to have to fold anyway, so you're just giving them less money. And then the other situation where you might want to min-raise is if they're really aggressive 3-betters. What this does is you put in less money. You put less money in the pot, so there's less incentive for them to 3-bet. And then also, they're going to have to 3-bet smaller, so that gives you the option of calling a little bit wider because you're going to have more of a stack to play with. Similarly, if there's a nit in the big blind, you can make it 2.5x from the small blind to just try to steal the blind for a little bit cheaper. Alright. Okay, so we talked about when you have the opportunity to open raise. Now we're going to talk about when you're facing a raise pre-flop. Obviously, you have three options. You can either fold, call, or 3-bet, which means re-raise. Your cold calling ranges should be tighter than your opening ranges because you do not have the chance to win the pot right away, i.e. stealing the blinds. You want to have a strong hand to play with against the pre-flop raiser, and you do not have initiative, which makes the hand generally a little bit tougher to play post-flop. When deciding whether to call or 3-bet, it's super important to have a post-flop plan. One of the biggest mistakes that players just starting out make, and even players that have, like micro-stakes players that have been playing for a while, is that they look at their hand and they choose to just call someone or 3-bet them, but they don't know what they're going to do post-flop. And this is really important to take into consideration, just so you don't make mistakes post-flop, so you can play well, and so you can make good decisions pre-flop. So, some questions that you might want to ask yourself. Is villain likely to c-bet the flop and check fold the turn? If the answer to that is yes, then you can probably start widening your cold calling range in position and plan on calling their c-bet and then betting the turn when they check to you. That's just like kind of a common situation that might come up. Another question you might want to ask is villain likely to call a 3-bet out of position and then check fold the flop? That's kind of a leak of some micro-stakes players, so if you think that's the case for someone who opened, then maybe you should 3-bet them with a wider range in position and then plan on continuation betting on the flop. So you can get them to call you pre-flop and put in more passive dead money that you can then take away on the flop. So basically, to determine the answers to these and more questions, you should just use observation and your HUD stats. Yeah. And then the positions that you should be 3-betting the most often from are the blinds, just basically so you don't have to play out of position, and also because people are going to be opening pretty wide from the cutoff and the button, so to try to steal the blinds. So by 3-betting, you can re-steal a lot of times and just pick up the pot. And again, that's going to depend on your opponents and your stats, etc. So when you are thinking about 3-betting from the blinds, you should be more inclined to 3-bet from the small blind than the big blind, and inversely more inclined to flat from the big blind than the small blind, because if you flat from the small blind and the big blind also flats, then you're forced to play in a 3-way pot out of position, and this probably is not going to be a profitable situation very often, especially when you're just starting out and you're not going to feel confident in what spots to donk lead and play back your opponents, etc. And then the other thing is that if you just flat from the small blind, you give the big blind the opportunity to squeeze. And a squeeze is a pre-flop 3-bet after there has already been a raise and one or more cold calls. So basically, if you call from the small blind, if someone from the button opens, you call from the small blind, and the big blind 3-bets, that's a squeeze. And it kind of sucks for you as the small blind cold caller, because you're probably just going to have to fold your hand. A squeeze is a good play to make. For example, if you are in the small blind, a loose cutoff opens and a loose button flats. And it's usually good to do this if you're doing it as a bluff, with hands that have blockers, something like ace-2 suited. You're probably not going to want to flat there because it's not strong enough to flat and play out of position. But since you have the ace, it makes it less likely that one of your opponents has a hand like ace-queen that they're going to want to call your squeeze with, just because of card removal. For it to be most effective, the players need to have not only wide opening and cold calling ranges, but also they must fold frequently to 3-bets. And again, you should be using your HUD stat for that, and also just watching the action at the table and seeing how often they're folding to 3-bets. Generally, if you're using your HUD, 70% or higher is a pretty high fold to 3-bet percentage, so that should make you inclined to both 3-bet bluff and squeeze pretty often. Alright. And then 3-betting is a pretty complex concept, as are many concepts in poker. So obviously I can't get into all things related to 3-bets in this video, but hopefully that gives you some sense. Okay, and here's kind of a little table that might give you a sense of when to cold call versus when to 3-bet in each position. Obviously, you should be folding everything else that's not listed. And these are super general guidelines, and also assuming both you and villain have 100 big blind stacks. When stacks are shorter, then generally you should be playing tighter. For example, you're not going to be able to set mine with pocket twos, and you're just not going to have as big enough of a stack to bluff with post-flop, etc. And on the other hand, when stacks are deeper, like when you have 200 big blind stacks or more, then you can really start playing more hands in position. You can start 3-betting a lot more in position. So your ranges are going to change a lot. But here's kind of a general table for 100 big blind stacks. Here in middle position we have very few hands to cold call, because when you call an under the gun open in middle position, it's pretty likely someone else is going to call behind you, and then you're just stuck in the middle in a 3-way pot with like a marginal hand if you choose to call with a marginal hand, which is really just going to be a bad spot. So pretty much the only hands that you should be cold calling in middle position are ace-queen suited, and then pocket fives through pocket queens. And you can 3-bet aces, kings, ace-king, and ace-queen off. The reason I have ace-queen off in here is because it's not good enough to just flat, and so it wouldn't be a mistake to fold, but I think it is good enough to turn into a 3-bet bluff, since you have the ace blocker and the queen blocker, and it's going to look super strong when you 3-bet from middle position. So usually you're going to get a lot of respect. If you get 4-bet by the preflop raiser, then you should be folding ace-queen off and ace-king after you 3-bet. You're basically turning those hands into bluffs, which is a good thing to do there because, again, you don't really want to play multi-way in the middle with those kinds of hands. And the reason for that is because if you make a pair, you're probably either not going to get paid off, or you're going to basically get coolered. You're going to like make top pair, top kicker, and someone else is going to have a set and get the money in when you're behind. So it's just like not going to be a profitable situation. So again, I'm not going to go over all these, but you can kind of just take note, try to get a general feel for the hand you should be flatting or 3-betting, and obviously folding when facing a raise preflop. And then play from the blinds is going to be really villain dependent. I didn't even put anything in the 3-bet table for playing from the blinds. I think the next slide is about that a little bit. Basically, you can probably be 3-betting like jacks plus from the blind for value, and then obviously your 3-bet bluffing range is going to totally depend on your opponent, and we don't really have time in this video to get into that. But one question that commonly comes up is I have king jack off in the big blind and the button opens. Should I call or should I 3-bet? Since the button's opening range is probably going to be pretty wide, king jack off is usually going to be a bit too strong to just fold from the big blind. So the question becomes, again, should you call or should you 3-bet? And clearly the answer is that it depends on who is on the button. And I'll just go over kind of the two different situations, when I would choose to 3-bet and when I would choose to flat. And I know this is a pretty specific hand, but this should hopefully give you a general idea about what to do in different spots from the blinds. Okay. If I do not have a decent read on the button, or if the button is a very good, tough player, I prefer to 3-bet. King jack off is a tough hand to play out of position, especially when you don't know much about villain, and also when villain will play very well against you. Oftentimes you'll win the pot right away when you 3-bet, and when you do get called, king jack off has decent equity. You can usually make like a half pot c-bet and win on the flop. Again, we'll get into that in the next video, and yeah. If your opponent is on the weaker side, and or if you have a pretty solid read, for example, is villain likely to c-bet the flop and fold to a check raise, then flatting or cold calling becomes a lot better. You will then effectively be able to both extract value and bluff when you know more about your opponent. And in those situations, it's better to flat than 3-bet to keep villain in the hand with a wide range, some of which you dominate. So for example, the button is going to be opening a lot of hands like Jack 8, Jack 9, Jack 10, King 10, King 9, and if you were to 3-bet, those hands would just fold. But if you flat, you keep those hands in, which is really good for you because you're going to be able to make money, make a decent amount of money when you make a pair sometimes, and also just be able to bluff more, like I said, if you choose the right spots. Alright, the last situation you can find yourself in pre-flop is when you're facing a limper. And limping is the act of just calling the big blind as opposed to folding or raising. And open limping should very rarely be done, and probably never at micro stakes. So when you do see someone limp, it's usually a sign that it's a weaker player and someone that you can start exploiting and making money from. So isolating is the act of raising after someone limps in order to isolate that player and play with him or her heads up. Generally, you can isolate limpers with a similar range that you would use to open raise yourself from whatever position you are in. So for example, if under the gun limps and you're in middle position, you can usually isolate with your middle position opening range. Often, however, you should be widening your range a little bit. Since limping is a sign of a weak player, and by isolating, you'll be able to play a raised pot in position versus a weak opponent. And basically, this is how you're going to make your money at micro stakes, by playing pots in position against weak opponents. So if you're in the cutoff and the middle position limps, you can start isolating with hands like Queen 8 suited, King 8 suited, hands that usually aren't really going to be good enough to open, but if you can have a chance to play in position against a weak player with those hands, you should take it. And obviously being able to play post-flop is a necessary part of that equation, but again, we'll get into that in the next video. Now, I mentioned open limping is generally never an option, but over limping, which is limping behind one or more limpers, is sometimes another viable option. One example, if the original limper only has around 40 big blinds, and you have a small pocket pair on the button, like pocket threes, the best play is usually going to be to overlimp instead of isolating. This way you're giving yourself better odds to set mine, i.e. flop a set and then extract value. And you also encourage other players to call as well, enabling you to play a multi-way pot in position for cheap, which is perfect with a small pocket pair. Because a small pocket pair is a hand that has implied odds, which means you're basically looking to make a set or better on the flop, and then just keep value betting. It's not the kind of hand you're going to want to bluff with too often post-flop, because basically you're just not going to have a lot of equity. Generally, if you miss the flop, you're only going to have 2 outs to improve. So that's just not really the kind of hand you want to inflate the pot with pre-flop. Alright, so that about does it for this video. I hope it wasn't too boring. I know, I'm just trying to go over the basics, and hopefully we can breeze through them as quickly as possible, and I hope it was helpful. And then the next video is going to focus on flop play. We're going to get into some more specific practical examples. I'm going to talk about continuation betting, facing continuation bets, check raising, bluff raising, floating, relative hand strength, and what you should be doing with different hand strengths and why, etc. If you have any comments or questions, there should be a space to leave comments for this video on iPoker VIP. You can also reach me personally at obliopokercoach@gmail.com. So thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you guys soon. Peace.